Okay, thank you for joining us. We're here today with Dr. Claire Sommers, a postdoctoral fellow of early modern British literature in the English department at Washington University in St. Louis. Her current book project, Chimeras, Centaurs, and Satyrs, creating mixed genre texts in antiquity and the Renaissance, argues that authors would use mythological figures such as the chimera or the satyr to symbolize the composite nature of their works and to demonstrate that hybridity is the means of transcending existing forms of expression. Her article on the role of shadows in Plato's cave was recently published in Arion. Claire was the creator and the founding director of the Critical Theory Certificate at the Graduate Center of CUNY. She currently serves as the Exhibits and Professionalization Coordinator of the Northeast Modern Language Association and the advisor to WashU's chapter of the English Honor Society, Sigma Tau Delta. And so Dr. Sommers is going to talk with us today about this whole notion of the monstrous, which has roots in antiquity. And we could just start with, Dr. Sommers. Most of us, when we think of monstrous, we think of, I don't know, aliens or Freddy Krueger or horror movies. So how did we get here? Or what? So obviously we wouldn't be talking to you if there weren't much more to the notion of the monstrous. And so enlighten us,
Yes. So thank you
please.
so much. So the monster is something that I think today is taken on a very negative connotation. As you pointed out in film, we have the Freddy Kruegers and all of that. But if you go back to the original Greek and Latin conceptions of the word, there were a lot more layers to the definition than we have today. The Greek word for monster was actually teros, and it could mean monster, but it could also mean wonder or marvel. So there was this idea that the monster was something to be marveled at and was something that was meant to amaze. And that doesn't necessarily have to have a negative connotation. Later, it could mean something that differed from the existing template, which is a lot of, something that was unusual in some way. But again, unusual and different does not always denote something that is scary or frightening. Sometimes these could be good differences or beneficial differences. In the Latin definition, it becomes even more explicit. The word monstrum, from which we get our monster, meant a divine sign or a portent of some such. And it was this idea that monsters were actually signs from the divine, something that were things that were meant to show us something or teach us or instruct us. So again, you can have omens of bad events, but you can also have more positive omens as well. And the fact that as humans, we are getting some kind of communication from the divine, even if it is of something bad, is a good thing. A divine message is still a divine message. And that particular aspect of the word monstrum has carried over into English and several of the Romance languages as well. We have the word demonstrate. And that word monstra, that monster in the middle, is indicative of that original function of the word monstrum or monster, which was to show us something.
Mm-hmm. I think we've talked on prior occasion about when I saw your session at NEMLA, you invoked Typhon Terrace
Yes.
by way of Plato. So can you tell us more about, bring us into that philosophical notion that Plato was trying to make use of with a monstrum, and also I think did I have the right excerpt from Phaedrus where was it Socrates is comparing himself to Typhon and Pegasus and basically monsters,
Exactly.
right? But what's that all about?
So in that passage, a lot of people read this passage. He starts talking about chimeras and pegasi and all of these different wondrous creatures, and he says, "Meh, I don't have time for that. I need to learn about myself before I can start, analyzing and giving explanations for all of these random monsters or phenomena that exist in the world." And I think a lot of interpretation of that passage has focused on Socrates' unwillingness to offer an interpretation and interpreted it as him basically saying, these things aren't worth my time, they're not real. But that's not actually what the passage says. The passage
Hmm.
just says, I need to know myself first before I can start to interpret what a chimera is. He's not making a claim on whether they're real or not. He just is saying, I can't interpret that until I know myself.
Hmm.
And it's very interesting that the chimera is the first creature that's invoked in that succession, because in Book 9 of Plato's Republic, he gives us this beautiful, rich metaphor icon where he actually says that the soul is a chimera or a Scylla or a Cerberus. And in all cases, those are monstrous, multi-part hybrid creatures. So he is acknowledging that humanity is essentially a chimera. And then he says, we're very familiar with the tripartite soul that Plato gives us, right? Of, logos, thumos, and eros. Here he gives us the metaphor of the soul where you have the soul is a chimera, and it's built of a hydra, which is Eros, the multi-headed monster that can go either good or bad, one way or another. You have the thumos of a lion or another beastly creature, and then you have the logos of man. And so even though it's all encased in the form of a man, even though we may look like a unitary human being on the outside, the soul is in fact this multi-part hybrid chimera. So
Hmm.
when we take that metaphor and we read it against that passage in the Phaedrus, where he said, I can't begin to understand chimeras until I understand myself, the passage becomes much more vibrant. And it's really, one has to remember that when we are talking about chimeras, we are actually talking about ourselves. If the soul is a chimera, the only way to understand chimeras is to understand ourselves, because it's one and the same. So
Interesting.
it's less about explaining natural phenomena and really just understanding ourselves. And go ahead. Sorry.
No, 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 please.
Then in the next breath, he asks if he's divine or he's more like Typhon, right? And Typhon is this multi-headed monster who's able to speak several different languages all at the same time in different voices. Like, he's one of these multi-voiced, hybrid, fascinating creatures in mythology. But one of the other aspects of him that is so fascinating is that he was the father of the chimera. So
Hmm.
this multi-headed, multi-voiced aspect of humanity is the thing that gives us an
Hmm.
allegory like the chimera and gives birth to this kind of hybrid nature that's within us all.
Fascinating. And as you're talking about that, it made me think of the paradox of psychology. If
Yes.
we look at the etymology of psychology, because when we think of mainstream clinical psychology, the medical model, very ego-based, the individual is a, you know, basically unitary concept, right? Subject to certain disorders or whatever, but you know, um, so there's that. But then the roots of the profession literally mean the study or the logic of the soul,
Yes.
which is, I assume would run counter to most. I don't think a lot of insurance boards would be on up for that interpretation, but certainly does, you know, work with archetypal psychology or psychoanalytic, um, really more in the Jungian vein than the Freudian Lacanian vein. Um, and actually, it reminds me of James Hillman,
Mm.
who actually maybe this is where he drew his thesis about the psyche,
Hmm.
from Plato, that it's the soul. It has many different. I think Typhon has a lot of different heads, right?
Yes.
I've seen it depicted different ways, but
Many heads, many voices.
different voices, different. That's just fascinating. I didn't know about the voices,
Yes, he
and
could speak in different
yeah.
voices, which is another aspect to it. I mean, serving dinner must have been hard. You got to imagine 40 plates and forks and setting quite a table for him.